Are you ready to become a change maker? Our 48-week postgraduate program in public policy or the PGP may be just the thing for you. This hybrid program is designed to give you both the theoretical foundation and hands-on experience needed to excel in policy making. With a mix of expert-led webinars, in-person workshops, and policy simulation exercises, you'll gain real-world skills along with personalized mentorship. Through our policy programs, we connect good people to good ideas and good networks. Apply now at the link in the description to make an impact.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat. Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I'm Manoj Kewalramani, the chairperson of the Indo-Pacific Studies program at the Takshashila Institution. And it is my pleasure today to host a special guest, the Honorable Lisa Singh, who is the CEO of the Australia-India Institute at the University of Melbourne. For those of you who don't know, the Australia-India Institute is a leading research and policy think tank advancing Australia's relationship with India at a government, business, diaspora, and academic level. And we are probably going to get into each of those levels today. She's also a former Australian senator and was the first woman of South Asian heritage to be elected to the Australian Parliament. And in 2014, she was awarded the Pravasi Bharatiya Samman by the President of India. So, Ms. Singh, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Manoj. It's lovely to be here at Takshashila Institution.
It's always a pleasure to have you around. I think the conversation is always lively. I mean, I'm going to get into the India piece and we'll talk about that. But I want to first step back and look at the world as it is. My reference point for what's happened over the last 50 years is somewhere around the movie Don't Look Up. We saw this asteroid coming, at least since November 5th, and it's hit on January 20th, and the world is different. And as much as we knew what we should expect, it's still been very surprising. So in terms of the changes in the United States with the election of Donald Trump, how do you look at the world today? Is it fundamentally different and changing, or are we overestimating some of the changes and there is resilience in the American system? And from an Australian point of view also, how are you looking at that relationship?
Well, Manoj, I definitely don't think we're overestimating. I think it's real, what we're facing. And I have to say, I wake up every day at the moment with a slight sense of unease, I would say. We are living in a very unpredictable time. I think the international rules-based order that we, all sort of want to live by in terms of shared norms and rules, of international law being, the sort of foundation of that, is now sort of, not necessarily how we all saw it before. And I think it is the change in the US administration that has led to that. It is simply unpredictable. And I think what it means is we can't rely anymore on America to have such a strong, pact with the Western alliance as we've always seen it. And I think, what does that mean? I mean, what does it mean for NATO? What does it mean for Article 5 of NATO? I think is something that really sits with me with a really strong sense of unease. But it also, I think, means it's a time for us to all recognise that we can't necessarily rely anymore on this sort of, strong country that America has been in global affairs for so long. It is retreating domestically on one level, then the next moment, unpredictably, it's back in the game. So I think this is where Europe, but also for Australia, the Western bloc, as we want to call it, needs to really rescope how we see the world as it stands. For Australia, though, I think we find ourselves, because we live in the Indo-Pacific region, in a very unique position. On the one hand, we've relied for a long time, since, the Second World War, on a US alliance, which has provided us with a security a pact that we have hoped that in moments of need we can rely upon. I don't think that's the case anymore. I think now we need, as a middle power, we're not a great power, but we are an influential power in our region. We need to really start to ramp up those sorts of new friendships we've formed with countries such as India, Japan, South Korea, to ensure that we start to create the regional order that we want to see for the region that we live in, whether America is playing a role in that or not.
Where does all of this leave, say, military cooperation with the United States, intelligence cooperation with the United States? The Five Eyes are under strain, particularly with the friction between Canada and the US. Where does all this leave AUKUS? And what's the domestic political debate? I mean, are the lines sort of sharpening, or is it a case that there is inertia in terms of, despite viewing that what you've articulated is a clear shock to the system around the world, is there inertia, or are the lines sharpening? For example, if I was to look at from an Indian perspective, I think there is a recognition of what's going on, but I still think that there is a certain degree of inertia that I don't think we've necessarily fully internalized, that this is something fundamentally shifting, and it's not a transient single administration thing that potentially will go away in a few years or with the next election. That there is something fundamentally shifting within American society, and that will have a long-term impact also. So what's the debate like in Australia around this?
Well, I think firstly, because of the strong relationship we have with the United States, not a lot of thinking has changed in some ways. On the one hand, there is this sense of uncertainty about the future of what we call the American guarantee, that, America will be there for us, come to our aid. But at the same time, it's sort of business as usual, because we do have this pact with AUKUS. We have given quite a lot of money to the United States to build our submarines, for example. But a lot of other factors are part of AUKUS. Information sharing is a really strong part of that. So in that sense, not a lot has changed, because we still do have that long-term agreement with AUKUS. And I know one of the first things that our Prime Minister Albanese did was pick up the phone to ensure AUKUS continues. Although I did see a strange press conference where President Trump was asked a question about AUKUS and he said, "What was that?" But let's hope that, AUKUS does continue and we do get our submarines in years to come. But I think there's so much more for Australia to consider in terms of this change of administration. As you know, we find ourselves in the Pacific region. The Pacific is what we call our VUVALE, which means, Pacific family. And the USAID withdrawal, or at least 90-day freeze on aid and development for the Pacific, is having huge ramifications for us and for our Pacific Island neighbours. And that is something that we need to really address. Now, if, that development withdrawal from the US remains, what's going to happen? We already have new agreements that China has created with Tonga, with Cook Islands. It's growing. And, it's a pretty big gap to fill for Australia. I mean, we're already playing a very active role with our Pacific Island neighbours and doing a lot to ensure that we do provide the necessary security and development and economic support that the region needs. But without the US there, that is a huge hole. Now, not a lot of discussion domestically is happening about that now, but I think in time to come, that will become more of an issue for us.
Right. I think, I concur that that's exactly, I think, how India has also reacted to it. What I'm seeing, that there is not a lot of discussion domestically, although there is lots of news coverage about developments, because there seems to be a shock a day. But I don't think the time has passed sufficient for perhaps that to take place. When you began with your first response, you talked about obviously shaping a regional order and Australia's role in shaping that regional order. Obviously, one of the biggest actors in the region, if you were to exclude the US, is China. And over the last decade or so, or a little bit more also, there's been this growing concern around China's role in the region. China's relationship with Australia over the last 5-6 years in particular has gone through tremendous ups and downs, with a trade friction over the origins of COVID, frictions over AUKUS, which China calls a small circle, a pact which is aimed at China. And yet there's now some sort of a rebalancing that's taken place with China. In the context of obviously what's happening in the US, but also Chinese policy, how is Australia today looking at China? Is there some sort of a rethink, or is there a sort of continuity in the policy of we need to engage, yet we perhaps need to build our own capacity? How is the approach towards China?
I think since about 2023, our Australian government has taken a more pragmatic approach to China. And you've seen that through the opening of dialogue and therefore the subsequent lifting of sanctions. Now, that has been, of course, very good for Australia. It's been very good for our farmers, our economic base, because China is a very, very big economic partner for Australia. That said, for some years now, Australia has really been trying to diversify our economic partners in our region. India is playing a huge role in that. But, this sort of balancing act between Australia having very strong alliance with the United States, whilst also trying to be pragmatic with our relationship with China in a trading sense, I think is a really sort of... It's a sensible one, but it's an interesting one because at the same time, we are still very wary of China and we are calling out certain human rights abuses or issues that we think are not, part of the rules-based order. So it's a balancing act, but I think the lifting of the sanctions, which, as you know, came out of the COVID-19 pandemic, on our barley, on our beef, on our wine, on a range of products, has been a very good thing. But going forward, I think that, the issues I raised about the Pacific, obviously there have been other issues which, relate to, you may want to ask me about.
Yeah, random vessels popping out in Australia.
Vessels, that's right. Now, it's interesting on that because in one way, China was not breaching UNCLOS, right? It was outside of that 200 nautical mile zone. But in another sense, it really was outside of what we would call, a normal sort of normative relationship that we would have with China, or at least what Australian Navy would do in reciprocating. And I refer there to the fact that we were really not given a formal notice. That, the formal notice period was not there. And over and above that, we are not sort of, Australian sort of zone of waterways is not part of any sort of trading, sort of route. So the whole sort of question of why is also there. I think there's been a lot of debate in our parliament in the past week about this, like why did all of this happen? Why did we not get at least 12 hours notice? We had to have a lot of commercial aircraft divert away from the area in which China was carrying out its sort of, its activities. And I think that lack of timely notification and also this sort of the miscommunication coming out of China's, live fire exercises, I think really raises a lot of concerns that Australian government are seeking answers on relating to military, diplomatic and political sort of activities. Not a great sort of way for our relationship to continue in that sort of pragmatic approach.
Yeah, and interesting timing for these actions to be carried out. I mean, one can read into it from the perspective of, well, look, where US allies are struggling to adjust to a new reality, and suddenly you're seeing Chinese vessels, pop up nearby, where they would otherwise not be. Again, the rebalance that you talked about with China has been interesting because it came after not just a period of friction on trade and the COVID-19 pandemic, but also friction in the South China Sea, where there were lots of incidents of Chinese sailors, Chinese soldiers pointing lasers at Australians, and those were dangerous incidents, right? And then we've seen those go down, or at least reporting of those go down, from what I understand. That's Chinese assertion in the South China Sea has been more around the Philippines over the past year, as opposed to necessarily the US or Australia or other actors. While they've been critical of other actors operating in the region, we've not seen these risky incidents anymore, right? And there's been some degree of a readjustment in that. Yet we're seeing potentially new zones of friction emerge. And again, on the Pacific Islands piece it's interesting because, like you said, if the idea of dealing with China is something that countries, including the United States, need to do together, Australia, the United States, India, Japan, the Quad is, one of the aspects of it is, well, the Quad is not anti-China. It's supposed to provide public goods. The pulling out of US aid potentially also weakens actions that such a grouping might take. So with that, I want to come to the Quad before I come to India, which is, how does Australia today view the utility of the Quad? In terms of, firstly, its deliverables, what are your assessments of, has the Quad been successful in what its mission has been, which stated is to provide public goods and options for countries in the region?
Look, I think the Quad has been very successful. Not necessarily in its delivery, though. I want to sort of, put that sort of caveat there. It's been successful in the sense of really sort of setting the normative agenda for the region that we live in. For these 4 countries, 4 democracies that are very vibrant, to be part of activity at the leadership level annually really sort of sets the scene for cooperation for our region. I think what's been interesting, though, in that is that over those years, the security element of the Quad has sort of diminished, and it has become more of a public goods, outfit. And so, and those public goods sort of, have been many and varied, from climate change to, vaccine provision and you name it. Now, I'd be interested to see if the Quad has a life now under this US administration, what that future looks like, because I would imagine the public goods focus of the Quad may actually diminish and it may become more of a security pact. It does have security originally in its title, but has not been referred to the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue for some time. It's just the Quad. So I think the S word may be seen a lot more prevalent under this Trump administration than we had under Biden. And that means the delivery of some of those public goods may change, particularly in sense of, I don't know, the belief factor of the Trump administration around some of those public goods. I mean, you have the Secretary of Health being run by someone who's an anti-vaxxer. You have Trump himself not really rusted on to climate change. That's going to really impact the activity and the working groups that the Quad is made up of. So what the direction and the focus of the Quad into the future is going to be, I think, will be more through a security lens. Now, how that plays out with China, I mean, China's always sort of seen it as a security sort of pact anyway, will be interesting. But I think what's really important is it's an opportunity where, in a sense, I call it minilateral. It's an opportunity for multilateralism, minilateralism to continue to be alive and well in an era under Trump where multilateralism is dying fast. And, and with this US withdrawal, whether it's from the World Health Organization, WTO, and, its position with NATO, the United Nations, the lot, I think this is where the Quad can actually be one that survives.
That's fascinating, right? I mean, it would be interesting to see if actually there is an overt security role that the Quad countries actually also state, because yes, there has been security components, and yes, there is the Malabar drills that we do, which is essentially the same countries, but we don't sort of, at least in terms of the language, you don't associate them together. And I guess that has a lot to do with, not just China, but also potentially of how other countries whom you might want to partner with, how they would view potentially partnering with the Quad in terms of their relationship with China. Just an associated question. In one of the things of the US policy right now that we're seeing is that, yes, one of the arguments for against NATO and or against at least a greater US role in Ukraine has been that, and this Pete Hex had said this when he was at the Ukraine contact group, was that we don't want to be essentially engaged here because we have bigger fish to fry with China. And is that something that potentially provides greater coherence in this time of confusion in the Australia-United States alliance? Is that something that has the potential to provide greater coherence if there is a clear stated approach towards China which is predictable and consistent?
Well, I think the US-China rivalry is shaping a new world order. And I think, Australia finds itself a little bit at the crossroads of where it sits in that. So, the Europe component, European leaders meeting at the moment in regards to Ukraine, I think is an interesting case in point. You've all of a sudden got a lot of European leaders really starting to step up in a defence and, in a military sense as well in terms of financial commitment. You've got Australia, however, as a middle power that's influential, but nevertheless finding itself sort of, wanting to continue to ensure we have this open trading relationship with China. It's a major part of our economic base. But at the same time, we want to continue this strong pact and alliance with the United States. So I think Australia is going to find itself in an interesting position in relation to this going forward. And I think that our pivot to India and other sort of Quad countries and other countries in the region is really going to help us navigate our way out of it.
Let us pivot to India now, which is I wanted to first start with the economic relationship, right? We had this brief trade deal, and we're negotiating a broader trade deal, potentially to include digital trade and other things also. Firstly, your assessment of given that the world is also seemingly turning away from free trade, is the current trade deal, is there belief on both sides that the current trade deal, the ECTA, has worked for both sides? And what's your sense of the momentum on a broader deal?
Look, the current trade deal has worked, the ECTA as we call it, the Economic Cooperation Trade Agreement. It's not a free trade agreement as such. It's a mini version of one. It's left out quite a lot of commodities and, some of the stuff that was too hard to get agreement on, basically. Yeah. Nevertheless, we had nothing before that. Since 2020, our relationship with India has been elevated. It became a comprehensive strategic partnership. Now, that meant both at the economic and the strategic level, annual meetings of so many of our ministers on these issues. But when I look at trade, I think really we are still really in our infancy. We do talk up, the achievements of ECTA, the fact that we've now reached 50 billion in terms of our two-way trade relationship. And I think that is a fantastic thing. But still, it is very much falling short of our trading relationship with China or the US. India, meanwhile, is trading all over the world and, becoming the fastest growing economy. I think it's on track to be the third largest economy worldwide pretty soon. So for a long time, I've been advocating that if we are not stepping up, other countries will come and start trading with India, and India's not sitting back waiting for Australia. So I'm really glad we've got ECTA, but there's still so much more we could be doing, and that's where the full free trade agreement comes into it. Now, I can't speak on behalf of our trade negotiators in Australia. I know they work very hard, but in the climate that we're in, I think it's going to take a little while. I really do, to actually get that signed and sealed. And agriculture, of course, has always been a sticking point in India in relation to that, understandably. But in the meantime, business in Australia and in India is sort of just getting on with it. And they're getting on with it because, yes, okay, there are some, free tariffed areas now, but also they're just getting on with it because of technology. India really is just, leaps and bounds ahead of Australia in terms of its footprint in AI, in technological advancements. And Australia has recognised it. We've got a massive skill shortage in Australia when it comes to cyber tech roles. And, we want something like 1.2 million people, working in tech by 2030. We are not on track to meet that. India can really help us in really bridge that gap. And when we talk about technology, of course, it's not just technology for day-to-day living. It's also military technology. It's also about our, strategic and defence sort of security footprint. Yeah. So I really see the future for Australia and India when we think of trade to be looking at defence industry, to be looking at, these huge cyber and critical technology gaps that we have that India can help us fill. And, yes, whilst the sort of commodities of agriculture and those other sort of sticking points need to be addressed, I think we'll still get on with ensuring our trading relationship can lift in other areas.
Yeah, right. So I wanted to pick up on one of the arguments that you made when you talked about the things that Australia and India can do together. You talked about Australia's need for about 1 million odd people from, skilled workforce, particularly in the tech domain. And while that is a partnership that can take place, and I think that there's obviously the number of Indians who moved to Australia. I remember 20 odd years ago looking at myself as a potential student abroad, looking at Australia as one of the destinations that I might want to go to. And many of my friends, obviously, and many of them actually did go and did study there. Some have settled there. But skilled migration also brings with it the possibility of cultural shift and cultural change within societies. And societies need to adapt. And this is something that we're seeing around the world, in the West, in India, where you have new migrants, whether skilled or unskilled, and that leads to changes in culture. And that leads to pushback. So what's the conversation in Australia around those kinds of issues? Because those are the kinds of things where you can end up seeing friction between governments and societies when some of those things happen. So what's the conversation around that?
Well, Australia is a multicultural country. I mean, it's our foundation, is our multicultural strengths of our difference. India particularly, or South Asian diaspora, over 1 million people strong now. And Indians are the highest tax-paying, highly professional, contributing massively to our tax base. But you're right, in a sense, there is a friction that still, unfortunately, exists. I mean, me, myself, I am Australian-born, but I am the daughter of an international student. So that student journey is a really important one. And I think something that was very much highlighted in we had a recent review known as the Parkinson Review of Australia's migration system. And it looked at the fact that simply attracting skilled talent into Australia is not enough, that, 1 in 4 migrants in Australia work below their skill level. Now, that is an issue. If we are attracting the best talent into the country from India or elsewhere, and yet they're not then getting into those jobs that relate to their qualifications, then what is the issue? And I think that is where, governments at the highest level really do need to break down some of that discrimination or those sort of cultural issues that do exist. I think one of the strengths, though, of Australia has been that our multicultural policy has been one that you live in Australia by a set of rules that are, the Australian law, and yet you continue to, maintain your own cultural way of life. And I think that is a fantastic thing, that the idea of being integrated into a multicultural society is not one where you give up your own identity and your own language and culture. In fact, Punjabi language in Australia is one of the fastest growing languages other than English at the moment. So all of that said, though, Manoj, what you talk about in terms of how all that plays out domestically is real. And we're about to go into an election cycle in Australia. And a lot of the discussion has been around housing. We have unfortunately, housing in Australia has got very high. We don't have enough housing stock. And so it's a very easy political football, so to speak, to blame migrants and to say, government's bringing in too many migrants. That's impacting housing. It's impacting infrastructure and transport. I really find that debate really disappointing when I've just shared with you the incredible benefits that migrants bring and the skill shortages that we still need to address. I mean, I talked about the tech sector. So we've got something like 7,000 graduates coming out of our university systems that are studying in, tech engineering. That's not enough to fill this massive gap that we have to, go into these cybersecurity jobs that we need to protect our future. So migrants are a very important story in Australia, a part of our country. But at the same time, I think a lot more needs to be happening at the policy level, education level, to really ensure that migrants are not discriminated and also given the best opportunity to fulfil their qualifications in the jobs that they should be granted.
Yeah. Let me look at the flip side. For the longest time, at least we here have been arguing that India should be much more open to foreign universities. And, we would love to see foreign university campuses in India. And now policy has changed. And I think there's one Australian university, Deakin University.
Two.
Okay. So is there a greater desire for universities in Australia to look at India seriously as a potential offshore campus? And then how does that play to this idea of skilled Indian talent moving to Australia, right? Because a lot of, like you said, right, a lot of the Indians who are going to Australia are going for education and then settling down over there. So there seems to be some sort of a contradiction in this argument. From an Indian point of view, we want universities to come here because there's a huge gap that we want to be filled. And it's also much better from a cost perspective from Indian students. But at the same time, yes, Australian universities and Australia's economy would require more skilled talent potentially coming from India. So how does that piece play? Firstly, from a university point of view in Australia, are universities looking at this much more actively, that we need to be looking at this, and are there plans across different universities that they're thinking about setting up campuses in India? And secondly, what would be the impact of that on migration to Australia?
Look, I think the national education policy that India has is a fantastic one and that opening up, as you say, to international or foreign universities to come and set up campuses is a great model. Wollongong University and Deakin University have done that in Gift City here in India from Australia. But there are other universities that have looked at other models to take advantage of that as well, not in a campus sense, but in a graduate and cost-fitting degree sense. For example, University of Melbourne has blended degrees where you do half your degree here in India at one university and you do the second half in Australia at the University of Melbourne. I think that is a great model. So the fact that there is flexibility now in how Australian universities can tap into this incredible young cohort of Indians who all want to be educated so much is a great problem for us to have. On the other side of that, Australian universities have become a lot more like businesses. And therefore, they do need to sort of, meet their bottom line and have a return on investment. And in that sense, international students for a long time have been, have really been providing that gap, and they've been doing it by actually being in Australia. So this idea of actually having Australian university presence here, I think is a really, really good one and an important one, and perhaps a more affordable one for certain students to look for. Australian universities are really high ranking. And I know that for a long time, Indians have wanted to look to, the other campuses in the Northern Hemisphere. The fact that now we do have a really good number of Indian students wanting to be educated through the Australian university system is a really good one. However, at the same time, there is a debate domestically around that as well. And there has been legislation in the Parliament to put a cap on the number of international students that Australian universities are able to take in. Now, the university sector, or at least the group of 8, which are the sort of the top ranked universities in Australia, have really pushed back on that. They want more international students. So finding new ways to deal with these domestic new pressures is going to be a challenge for Australia. I hope it doesn't damage our relationship with India in terms of delivering on education.
Yeah.
I think the fact that our two education ministers meet each year,
Yeah.
I often get invited to those meetings and, see the communique that comes out where we have all sorts of commitments. We try to help deliver for the two countries on that as an institute as well.
Yeah.
We do a lot in research collaboration. We run fellowships and the like to ensure Indians can come to Australia and be part of our higher education system. But I think going forward, we're going to have to think of new ways for Australian universities to really tap into the Indian system that's not just about Indian students on campus in country.
Yeah. All right. As we're close to wrapping up, I have two last questions. The first one is around, in my observation of the India-Australia relationship, and particularly since I've been in Bangalore at Takshashila, I've engaged quite extensively with the Australian consulate here, and they've been wonderful friends, and I think it's been remarkable to see how Australia has quite actively engaged with not just the Indian government, but also the Indian education sector, think tank sector, businesses. There's been a transformation in the relationship over the last decade or so. What's been the thought process, and how has Australia been different in terms of its approach? So what's been the thinking behind how should we approach India, as opposed to say how other countries have been? So what's been the thinking about how do you approach India?
Well, I think firstly, we need to really recognise, Manoj, I mean, you just outlined very strongly the strength of the relationship currently. But we also need to remember how far we've come and where we've come from. I mean, these are two countries that were on opposite sides of the Cold War blocks.
Yeah.
And now we're trusted partners. We're doing Malabar exercises of defence together. We're information sharing on MDA, all sorts of activities that make us such strong partners. I think Australia has really put its money where its mouth is in the sense of, as you say, we've got consulates general in 4 different cities in India, as well as a really large, ambassadorial footprint in Delhi. It's a very high-ranked post now, India. That was not once the case. I think a lot of that is a recognition, and it's a recognition that is bipartisan, so it doesn't matter who is in government in Australia, that this is a relationship for the long term, and it's built on relationships. Unlike China, our relationship with China is much more transactional. This relationship with India is all about relationships. So you do see our two prime ministers, talking about Dosti and my good friend.
Yeah.
You would never have seen that in the past.
Yeah.
And in fact, it took a very long time, I think, as an Australian Prime Minister to visit India and vice versa.
Yeah.
And yet now, look, we have annual meetings of our two Prime Ministers. We have all of these commitments. I mean, the last one was on the sides of the G20 where both Prime Ministers Modi and Albanese signed a partnership on renewable energy.
Yeah.
There's so much that comes out of the relationship, not just through meeting each other, but actually, delivering on this comprehensive strategic partnership. So I think it's more the fact that we see each other as long-term partners, building relationships, shared interests. Of course, we want to live in a peaceful region. We want a much more stronger, diversified economic base. I think the supply chain diversifications in critical minerals is a good example of that.
Yeah.
We don't want semiconductors all tied up in Taiwan and China.
Yeah.
So there's all sorts of imperatives that make us want to act closer together, but it's also the way in which we do it. We do it really based on a sense of friendship and a sense of relationship building. And I think if you can do something through that lens in foreign policy, then you're going to be there for the long term.
Fantastic. My final question, therefore, is that forward-looking. And you can be as elaborate or as brief as you want. 3 things that you want Australia and India to be able to achieve over the next year or 2.
Wow, that's a good little snapshot to close out on, Manoj. Look, I would like to see Australia and India doing more to support island states in our region, be it islands in the Pacific or islands in the Indian Ocean. I would like them acting more closely on addressing the issues that island states face, be it climate change or disinformation or infrastructure safeguarding. So in that sense, that's probably my number one pick that I want the relationship to be doing. I think secondly, delivering more in the public goods space would be something we could do a lot more stronger together. Again, helping the the global south in our region really have that strong support from two trusted partners would be there. And then thirdly, just being really active, strong leaders in the Quad so that the Quad does have a future, so that minilateralism or multilateralism has a future. I'm a bit of a multilateralist and I guess goes back to the first question you asked me, Manoj, about how I'm waking up in the morning with this sense of unease. That sense of unease comes through the fact that I'm seeing multilateralism dying in a sense. Whereas I think that collective activity for solving some of the world's problems is the best method. So if I can see Australia and India continuing to do that through the Quad, then I won't wake up so uncomfortable.
Fantastic. And I hope that each of those three things are absolutely valuable, and I completely concur with you. And I think that those are the kinds of things that our countries should be working towards. Thank you so much, Ms. Singh, for taking the time.
Thank you, Manoj, for having me.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.